All right, welcome to the deep dive. You guys know the drill by now. You're here because you like to understand things, really understand,
Yeah.
and you want to get to that understanding efficiently. Today, we're going deep, really deep into something incredibly personal, something one of you shared with us, and that is your evolving experience with double penetration.
Yeah, fascinating topic.
We're going to be looking closely at your own reflections on this,
Great.
tracing how your desires, your comfort levels, all of that have evolved over time.
And that's really what we're all about here on the deep dive. We want to go beyond just, the surface narrative. We
Right.
want to get to those underlying dynamics of sexual exploration, what makes us tick,
Exactly. Hey, yeah.
And I think by diving deep into your personal account, we're going to uncover some really valuable insights into how our desires take shape, what makes them change, why they change, and, what happens when those fantasies we all have meet our actual lived experiences.
Okay, so let's go back to the beginning.
Yeah.
Your first real exposure to the world of sex.
Yeah.
And your early reactions. You told us about this first encounter with porn, in a kind of casual group setting, right?
Mm-hmm.
You were 17 at the time.
Oh, wow. 17? Yeah, that can be a pretty impactful age for something like that.
It sounds like it really was.
Yeah.
Especially, you mentioned having a very strict religious upbringing,
Right.
where sex was, well, let's just say, not exactly a topic of open conversation.
Not on the dinner table.
No,
Yeah.
not at all. So suddenly, you're hit with all this explicit content, and it's in this group setting, no less. I mean, that's going to create a pretty strong reaction, right?
Absolutely. It just highlights how much our personal histories, the values we were raised with, they really act as filters for how we first understand, how we even accept different sexual expressions.
Mhm.
What might seem totally natural or even exciting to one person can be really jarring or even, like you said, overwhelming to someone else.
Exactly, yeah. And it wasn't just, the general idea of sex in the porn that got to you. You talked about being really uncomfortable with the girl-on-girl scenes,
Right.
specifically because of things like, the long nails
Mm-hmm.
and the way it seemed rough. It felt fake to you.
Uh-huh.
And you even said, quote, they were clearly just gay for pay.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a strong initial assessment.
It is, but it's also really fascinating because even in that very first experience, you were already picking up on these nuances and how things were portrayed.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, you contrasted that, right, with your later experiences watching girl-on-girl porn, but this time privately.
Right.
And those felt totally different. You mentioned shorter nails, a sense of genuine passion.
Right.
That just goes to show how subjective it all is, how we interpret sexual content, our perception, whether we're turned on or not. It can all change so dramatically based on sometimes even really subtle visual cues, like the nails.
Yeah, and like you said, that sense of authenticity or the lack of it.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, so then it seems like that initial, kind of leaning towards girl on girl, it broadened out over time.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned moving on to threesomes after about a year. You even described it as staying in a safe zone.
Interesting.
Why do you think that dynamic felt safe to you at that point?
Well, the safe zone idea, it probably reflects, a gradual expansion of your comfort levels. Threesomes, yeah, they bring in another person, but they still had that element you initially found appealing,
Right.
the women. And that's pretty common, I think, when we explore new aspects of sexuality.
Makes sense.
We tend to expand our comfort zones bit by bit, often starting with elements that feel familiar, less threatening.
That's a good point. And then, then you met D.
Ah, yes, D sounds like a pivotal person in your journey.
Really pivotal. You described them as the, quote, hottest person you'd ever seen.
Wow.
And their acceptance, the way they made you feel so comfortable, it seemed to really open up some new possibilities for you sexually.
That speaks volumes about the power of relationships. And open, accepting communication. It's huge. When we feel secure, unjudged with a partner, it can really unlock desires and fantasies that we might have been holding back. Maybe even stuff we weren't fully aware of.
And it sounds like that's exactly what happened. You went from that safe zone of threesomes,
Yeah.
and you started exploring, what you called rougher sex.
Okay.
Choking, gagging, spanking even. And even you were intrigued by the idea of gangbangs. Though you were clear about wanting to stay monogamous,
Right.
it seems like a pretty big jump. What do you think was the main driver behind that shift?
I think that newfound sense of freedom and validation you felt with D was key.
Uh-huh.
Their acceptance probably empowered you to acknowledge those desires, the ones that might have always been there, but you hadn't really voiced them or acted on them before. And the excitement you mentioned around the idea of having more than one dick in the room, even if it was within a monogamous fantasy, it suggests a growing curiosity about different sexual dynamics, a desire to push those boundaries a little further.
Which brings us to the double penetration. You said even after things ended with D, this interest stuck around.
Well,
It even got stronger, becoming like a primary focus during masturbation. But you also talked about feeling intimidated by actually trying it with two partners.
that makes sense. It's a pretty common experience.
Mm-hmm.
That gap, between what we fantasize about and then actually trying to make it happen in real life, there can be practical concerns, social anxieties.
Absolutely.
And that's where solo exploration comes in. It's a valuable way to bridge that gap. You get to understand the physical sensations, your own personal preferences, without all the complexities of involving someone else.
Right. So let's talk about your solo experimentation. You were very thoughtful about it. You decided to, quote, work your way up to it. You used two similarly sized dildos, made sure you have plenty of lube, and you even thought about using lube for your vagina, but then decided you didn't need to.
Wow. Very methodical.
Why do you think that kind of preparation was so important to you at that moment?
I think it really shows a mindful, intentional approach to exploring a new sensation. It's like you wanted to feel in control, comfortable, especially because you were venturing into unfamiliar territory physically. And that methodical approach, the anticipation, even having an orgasm beforehand, it probably helped to ease any anxiety you might have been feeling. And it let you really focus on those new sensations.
And what about the initial physical sensation itself? You described it as feeling full and stretched in a way that was surprisingly intense, even though your body had obviously experienced, those areas being stimulated before, but individually.
Right. It's interesting how that works. Even if the individual sensations aren't totally new, when you stimulate both the vagina and the anus at the same time, you get this unique, often very heightened sensory experience.
I see.
It's probably because of all the nerve endings being activated simultaneously in both areas, so you end up with this combined sensory input that can feel quite different from stimulating each area on its own.
Oh, that's really interesting. And then you mentioned the challenges of, the coordination, the movement. Thrusting both dildos together wasn't as amazing as you thought it would be, but moving one at a time felt much better.
Yeah.
What does it tell us about, the difference between what we imagine something will be like and then the actual physical experience?
I think it shows how our brains, they can sometimes oversimplify or kind of idealize sexual acts in our fantasies.
Hmm.
The reality is, when you actually experience it physically, there are all these nuances, like how you move, the pressure, the coordination, things we don't always account for when we're just playing it out in our heads.
Right.
So your discovery that alternating the movements felt better, it highlights how important physical feedback is,
Yeah.
experimentation. That's how we figure out what truly brings us pleasure.
So true. Okay, then you move on to your first experience with a partner.
Hmm.
You met him on Tinder. You described it as an on-again, off-again, friends with benefits situation. How did you guys even start talking about double penetration?
It sounds like you already had a pretty comfortable, open dynamic. Friends with benefits, that can often make it easier to bring up more adventurous ideas, things that might be considered less conventional. And his reaction was interesting, too. Open to using a toy, but hesitant about another man being involved.
Right, yeah.
That's pretty common. People often have different boundaries and comfort zones when it comes to different types of sexual encounters.
When you finally did try it with M, it was his penis in your vagina and a dildo in your anus, kind of mirroring your solo experience, but with the added dynamic of a partner. You mentioned that he was your largest partner ever and that anal sex with him was infrequent. Did those factors play a role in how intense the experience was?
I'd say so, yeah. His larger size and the fact that you weren't used to anal sex with him probably contributed a lot to the intensity.
Yeah.
Combining a potentially more intense vaginal sensation with the anal stimulation, even with the dildo, it's going to create a really powerful, maybe even overwhelming physical response.
And overwhelming is definitely the word you used to describe it. You talked about a quick, intense orgasm, whole body quivering, pussy gushing wetness, and then you kept going until you were physically exhausted. That sounds pretty profound.
It does, and it just goes to show how the combination of different stimuli plus the presence and movements of a partner, the whole dynamic of the encounter, it can all amplify the physical sensations way beyond what you might experience alone.
Mm-hmm.
The partner's energy, their engagement, it has a huge impact on the pleasure.
And now you're thinking about the future. You still want to experience double penetration, But with two partners, you're considering different scenarios with M, like inviting another woman and using a strap-on, or him becoming open to an MMF threesome. What do these desires tell us about how your preferences are continuing to evolve?
Well, it shows you're still exploring different sexual dynamics and that interest in double penetration is still there. The idea of involving another woman and the strap-on, that speaks to your bisexuality and maybe a desire to bring a different kind of female energy into the experience.
Yeah.
And being open to an MMF threesome suggests you're becoming more comfortable with the idea of multiple partners and different configurations to achieve that specific kind of stimulation.
It's amazing to see how your desire has progressed.
Yeah.
From never even considering it to now it's something you want to be a part of your sex life, even if it's not an everyday thing. What's the biggest takeaway here about, like, the fundamental nature of sexual desire and exploration?
Your journey is a perfect example of how sexual desire is not this fixed thing. It's fluid. It changes and adapts based on our experiences, our relationships, and our continued exploration of what brings us pleasure. You started out uncomfortable, even uninterested, then that turned into curiosity. Positive experiences opened up new horizons and desires, and your fantasies became a starting point for real-life exploration and discovery.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive into your personal experience with double penetration, we've really seen how your desire and your comfort have evolved. We talked about those aha moments, how influential a trusted partner can be, how much we can learn through solo experimentation, and those sometimes surprising differences between fantasy and reality.
You've shared a really powerful story, and it raises a really important question for everyone, not just you. How do our individual explorations, these ever-shifting desires, reflect broader human experiences? Our curiosity, the search for intimacy, and those constantly changing personal boundaries we all have. It's definitely something worth thinking about.
Absolutely.